Close your eyes and breathe in the scent of fresh-cut timber, the salt air of harbors, the ancient smell of tar and oakum. We are about to embark on a journey through time, through the careful hands of shipwrights who have, for thousands of years, shaped wood into vessels that carried humanity across the waters of the world. The art of wooden shipbuilding is one of humanity's oldest crafts, stretching back at least 10,000 years to when our ancestors first hollowed out logs to create dugout canoes. These simple vessels were the beginning of a tradition that would eventually conquer the oceans. Wood was chosen not just for its availability, but for its remarkable properties. It floats, it bends, it can be shaped with simple tools, and when properly maintained, a wooden ship can last for centuries, carrying generations across the seas. Every wooden ship begins as a dream, a design scratched into parchment or carved as a small model. The shipwright must envision how this vessel will move through water, how it will flex and bend with the waves, how it will breathe and work as a living thing. For a ship is indeed alive in its way. Wood expands and contracts with moisture. Timbers creak and groan as they work together. A well-built wooden ship moves with the sea rather than fighting against it, a harmony between craft and nature. Let us drift back in time, to the banks of the Nile, where the ancient Egyptians were among the first to build sophisticated wooden vessels. Around 3000 BCE, they constructed ships from short planks of acacia wood, lashed and pegged together with remarkable skill. These early Egyptian ships had no keel, the central backbone that would later define shipbuilding. Instead, they relied on a heavy rope running from bow to stern, tensioned to prevent the ship from sagging in the middle, a technique called a hogging truss. The Phoenicians, those master sailors of the ancient Mediterranean, revolutionized ship design around 1200 BCE. They built sturdy merchant vessels with rounded hulls and developed the biremes and triremes, warships with multiple banks of oars. Phoenician shipwrights discovered that cedar from the mountains of Lebanon was ideal for shipbuilding. Cedar is naturally resistant to rot and insects, lightweight yet strong, and it could be cut into long, straight planks. These ancient builders worked without written plans, passing knowledge from master to apprentice through demonstration and experience. The shape of a ship lived in the mind and hands of the shipwright, refined over generations. The Greeks refined the trireme into a formidable war machine, a sleek vessel powered by 170 rowers arranged in 3 tiers. These ships were built for speed and ramming, their bronze-clad rams designed to punch through enemy hulls. Building a trireme required extraordinary precision. The hull had to be light enough for speed yet strong enough to withstand combat. Every timber was carefully selected and shaped to reduce weight while maintaining strength. The Romans, though less naturally inclined to the sea than the Greeks, became master shipbuilders through necessity. They built massive grain ships to feed Rome, vessels that could carry 1,000 tons of wheat across the Mediterranean. Roman merchant ships featured a distinctive rounded hull shape and were among the first to use multiple masts and sails, allowing them to harness wind more efficiently than their predecessors. The Vikings emerged around 700 CE as perhaps the most skilled shipwrights of the medieval world. Their longships were masterpieces of engineering, capable of crossing oceans yet shallow enough to navigate rivers and beaches. The creation of any wooden ship begins in the forest, where the shipwright walks among the trees, looking not just at the wood but at the shape of each tree, the curve of its growth, the strength hidden within. Oak became the supreme wood for European shipbuilding, prized above all others for its strength, durability, and resistance to rot. A large warship might require 2,000 mature oak trees, representing centuries of growth. The shipwright learned to read trees like books. A tree grown in dense forest would be tall and straight, perfect for masts and planking. A tree grown in open land would have curved branches, ideal for the naturally curved structural pieces called compass timbers. These compass timbers were among the most valuable parts of any tree. The knees that supported decks, the ribs that formed the skeleton of the hull, these required wood that naturally curved, following the grain for maximum strength. Trees were felled in winter when the sap was down, making the wood less prone to splitting and rot. The best time was during a waning moon, according to tradition, though this was likely more superstition than science. After felling, logs were seasoned, dried slowly over months or even years. Green wood, freshly cut, contains too much moisture and will warp and crack as it dries. Patience was essential. Rushing this process would doom the ship. Different woods served different purposes. Pine and fir were used for masts and spars. They grew tall and straight, and their lightness aloft reduced the ship's tendency to capsize. Elm, resistant to water, was used below the waterline. Teak, discovered by European shipbuilders in Asia, proved to be extraordinarily durable. It contains natural oils that repel water and resist rot, and it doesn't swell or shrink as much as other woods with changes in moisture. In the Caribbean, mahogany and lignum vitae were prized. Lignum vitae, the wood of life, is so dense it sinks in water, making it perfect for pulley blocks and bearings where hardness and where resistance were essential. The shipwright developed an intimate knowledge of wood, how it would behave when steamed and bent, where it would be strong, where it might split, how it would age and weather over decades at sea. Every ship begins with the keel, the backbone upon which everything else is built. The keel-laying ceremony was sacred, often accompanied by prayers and offerings, for the ship's life began at this moment. The keel timber must be straight and true, chosen from the finest trees in the forest. For a large ship, the keel might be 150 feet long, requiring a single enormous tree or multiple timbers joined with complex scarf joints. A scarf joint overlaps two pieces of wood in a precisely cut diagonal, secured with wooden pins called treenails. When properly made, a scarf joint is as strong as a single piece of timber, invisible in the finished ship. The keel is laid upon massive wooden blocks in the shipyard, positioned perfectly level and aligned. Any error here will be magnified throughout the construction, creating a ship that doesn't sail true. At the forward end of the keel rises the stem, the curved timber that forms the ship's bow. The stem must be strong enough to split the waves, shaped to lift the bow over seas rather than plowing through them. At the aft end stands the stern post, to which the rudder will be hung. The stern post must bear tremendous forces as the rudder turns, pushing thousands of tons of ship through the water. The keelson, an internal timber, is laid atop the keel inside the hull, sandwiching the ribs between them. This internal keel reinforces the entire structure, binding the ship's skeleton together. In Viking longships, the keel was cut from a single oak tree, chosen for its straight grain and freedom from knots. This keel was flexible enough to bend with the waves, giving the ship its legendary seaworthiness. The keel's depth determined a ship's ability to sail upwind. A deeper keel provided more lateral resistance, allowing the ship to sail closer to the wind rather than being pushed sideways. Shipwrights knew that a ship with a deep keel could point higher into the wind but would draw more water, limiting which harbors it could enter. Every design was a balance of compromises. From the keel rise the ribs, the curved timbers that give the ship its shape. These frames are the skeleton upon which the skin of planks will be hung, and their spacing and curvature determine everything about how the ship will sail. Traditional shipbuilding used two methods: frame-first construction, where ribs were erected before planking, and shell-first construction, where planks were laid first and frames added later for reinforcement. The Vikings used shell-first construction, building their ships from the keel up with overlapping planks, each one slightly lapped over the one below. This clinker-built method created light, flexible hulls that could bend with the sea. Mediterranean builders preferred frame-first, carvel construction, where planks were laid edge to edge, creating a smooth hull. This method required more precision but created stronger ships for rougher seas. Each frame was shaped using patterns, full-size drawings scratched into the loft floor of the mold loft, a large open space where the ship's lines could be laid out in actual size. The master shipwright walked these patterns, checking curves with his eye and hand, adjusting until the flow was perfect. The shape existed first in his mind, then on the floor, then in the wood itself. Frames were assembled from multiple pieces, the floor timber crossing the keel, the futtocks rising up the sides, the top timbers reaching to the deck. Each piece was carefully fitted and fastened. Steaming allowed wood to be bent without breaking. The timbers were placed in a steam box, heated until the moisture in the wood became pliable, then quickly bent over forms and clamped until cool and set. The frames were spaced along the keel at regular intervals, their spacing determined by the ship's size and purpose. A warship required closer spacing for strength, while a merchant ship might have wider spacing to maximize cargo capacity. Between the frames, filler pieces called deadwood were fitted at the bow and stern, solid blocks of timber that gave these critical areas extra strength and provided attachment points for the outer planking. Now comes the skin, the planking that transforms the skeleton into a ship. Each plank must be carefully shaped to follow the curves of the frames, bending in 2 dimensions, twisting as it runs from bow to stern. The garboard strake, the plank immediately next to the keel, is the most challenging to fit. It must twist dramatically from the straight run amidships to the sharp curves at bow and stern, following the keel's changing angle. Planks were typically 2 to 4 inches thick and as long as could be obtained from a single tree. Longer planks meant fewer joints, fewer potential places for leaks to develop in the finished hull. Each plank was fastened to the frames with tree nails, wooden pins driven through pre-drilled holes. When wet, the tree nails would swell, creating a tight, permanent joint that worked with the wood rather than against it. Iron and later copper nails and bolts were also used, but these required careful placement. Iron rusts, and rust expands, potentially splitting the wood. Copper was better but expensive, used mainly below the waterline. The planks were caulked, their seams sealed to make them watertight. Oakum, made from old rope fibers, picked apart and twisted, was driven into the seams with caulking irons and mallets. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of caulking mallets was the signature sound of every shipyard, dozens of workers simultaneously driving oakum into miles of seams, creating a percussion that echoed across the harbor. After caulking, the seams were sealed with hot pitch or tar, a mixture of pine resin and other substances that remained flexible as the ship worked. The smell of hot tar became synonymous with shipyards. The hull's shape determined its sailing characteristics. A full, rounded hull could carry more cargo but sailed slowly. A sharp, narrow hull cut through water faster but had less cargo capacity. The shipwright learned to read the water flow around the hull, understanding that smooth, fair curves would allow water to flow past easily, while bumps and irregularities would create turbulence and slow the ship. A ship's strength comes not from any single timber, but from how all the pieces work together. The hull must flex and work, absorbing the tremendous forces of wind and waves without breaking. Deck beams ran from side to side, supporting the deck planking and preventing the sides of the ship from spreading apart under the pressure of cargo and the outward push of the masts. Hanging knees and lodging knees, L-shaped pieces of naturally curved timber, connected the deck beams to the frames and hull planking, triangulating the structure for immense strength. In larger ships, riders, massive internal timbers, ran along the inside of the hull, adding longitudinal strength and helping to distribute the weight of masts and cargo throughout the structure. The wales, thick external planks running along the hull, provided additional strength. The main wale, at the widest part of the hull, might be twice as thick as normal planking. In warships, the gun deck required enormous strength to support the weight of cannons and absorb the shock of their firing. Heavy deck beams and extra knees were essential to prevent the deck from collapsing. Diagonal bracing, running at angles through the internal structure, resisted the twisting forces that occurred when the ship sailed at an angle, heeled over by the wind in its sails. The entire structure was designed with redundancy. If one timber failed, others would share the load. A ship could lose planks, crack frames, even split a mast, and still remain seaworthy if properly built. Shipwrights understood that what worked, that it expanded and contracted with moisture and temperature. The joints were designed to allow this movement without failing, using wooden pins that moved with the wood. The best ships had a certain give, a flexibility that allowed them to bend with the waves. A rigid ship would eventually break, a flexible ship would ride the seas for decades. The deck was not just a floor, but an essential structural element, tying the two sides of the hull together and providing lateral stiffness to the entire vessel. Deck planks ran lengthwise, from bow to stern, laid tightly together and caulked just like the hull planking. A ship might have multiple decks, each one adding strength and providing space for cargo, guns, or crew. The main deck, where sailors worked and weather was endured, was often made from pine or fir, woods that were relatively soft and easy to replace when worn by constant foot traffic and maintenance. Gratings, sections of deck made from cross slats with spaces between, allowed light and air to reach the decks below while water could drain through them freely during storms or when washing the deck. Companionways, the stairs connecting different decks, were steep and narrow to save space. Often they were barely more than ladders, and sailors learned to climb them effortlessly even in heavy seas. Hatches, covered openings in the deck, allowed cargo to be loaded and unloaded. In storms, these hatches had to be battened down, sealed tight with tarps and battens to prevent water from flooding the holds. The camber of the deck, its gentle upward curve from side to center, wasn't just for appearance. This curve shed water to the sides, preventing it from pooling on deck and adding weight high up where it would make the ship unstable. Waterways, channels running along the edges of the deck where it met the hull, collected water and directed it to scuppers, holes through the bulwarks that allowed water to drain overboard. The quarterdeck, raised at the stern, gave officers a commanding view of the ship and the sea. From here, the captain and helmsman controlled the vessel, elevated above the working sailors. The forecastle, raised at the bow, provided shelter and additional space. Its name comes from the medieval practice of building actual castle-like structures on ships, though by the age of sail, the forecastle was more modest. The masts were the ship's power source, tall spars reaching skyward to catch the wind. Their placement and proportions determined everything about how the ship would sail. The main mast was stepped, planted, in a massive timber called the mast step, which sat directly atop the keel. The mast passed through each deck, held in place by partners, reinforced openings that gripped the mast firmly. A mast for a large ship might be 3 feet in diameter and over 100 feet tall, weighing several tons. Raising such a mast required careful coordination and often a sheer legs, a crane made from long spars. Masts were made from the tallest, straightest trees available. White pine from New England was prized, as were fir trees from the Baltic. A single tall pine could be worth more than all the other timber in the ship. For very large ships, masts were built from multiple pieces joined together. These built masts were stronger than single-tree masts of the same size, as the pieces could be arranged to cancel out each other's natural tendency to warp. The lower masts were permanent, but the topmasts and topgallant masts above them could be struck down, lowered, in heavy weather or when not needed, reducing weight and windage aloft. The bowsprit, a mast angled forward from the bow, extended the ship's rig forward and provided attachment points for the headsails that helped the ship steer and sail close to the wind. Standing rigging, the network of ropes and cables supporting the masts, was essential. These stays and shrouds formed a web of support, triangulating the masts so they wouldn't fall forward, backward, or to the side. The shrouds, running from the masthead to the sides of the ship, had ratlins, horizontal ropes, woven through them like ladder rungs, creating the distinctive rope ladders sailors climbed to tend the sails aloft. Deadeyes and lanyards formed adjustable connections in the standing rigging, allowing the tension to be fine-tuned. A deadeye was a round wooden block with 3 holes. Lanyards threaded through them created a powerful mechanical advantage. Running rigging, the ropes used to control the sails, was a complex system of halyards to raise yards, braces to angle them, and sheets to control the corners of the sails themselves. A large ship might have miles of rope in its rigging, ranging from thick cables for the mainstays down to thin lines for controlling small sails. Each rope had a specific name and purpose, and sailors had to know them all. Blocks, the pulleys of the sailing ship, were carved from hard wood and contained wheels called sheaves. These reduced the friction of running ropes and provided mechanical advantage for controlling heavy sails and yards. Sails were made from canvas, woven from flax or hemp. The fabric was heavy and stiff when new, but it softened with use and had to be replaced every few years as sun and salt weakened the fibers. A sailmaker was a specialist craftsman, working with massive panels of canvas, cutting and stitching them into the precise shapes required for each position on the ship. Sails were reinforced with ropes sewn around their edges, called bolt ropes, which took the strain and prevented the canvas from tearing. The corners, where forces were greatest, had multiple layers and metal grommets. Square sails hung from horizontal yards and were the primary driving sails on most large ships. They were efficient when sailing downwind but less effective when trying to sail toward the wind. Fore and aft sails, triangular or quadrilateral sails set parallel to the ship's centerline, allowed ships to sail much closer to the wind. The development of these sails revolutionized sailing in the 17th and 18th centuries. The lateen sail, a triangular sail hung from a long yard at an angle, was developed in the Mediterranean and allowed ships to sail effectively at many different angles to the wind. By combining square sails for power with fore and aft sails for maneuverability, the full-rigged ship emerged as the dominant design, capable of sailing efficiently in almost any wind condition. The rudder, hanging from the stern post, was the ship's primary means of steering. This massive blade of wood, extending deep into the water, turned the ship by deflecting water flow past the stern. Ancient ships used steering oars, large oars hung over the side near the stern. The term starboard comes from this, the steerboard is side, typically the right side where the steering oar was mounted. The invention of the centerline rudder, hinged to the stern post, was a medieval innovation that dramatically improved ship control. This rudder was more powerful and easier to control than steering oars. The rudder was controlled by a tiller, a long wooden bar attached to its top. Moving the tiller to one side turned the rudder, and thus the ship, in the opposite direction. Later ships used a ship's wheel connected to the tiller through a system of ropes and pulleys. The wheel gave better mechanical advantage and allowed helmsmen to steer from a more convenient position on the quarterdeck. The wheel was typically several feet in diameter, with 8 or more spokes radiating from the center. In heavy weather, it might take 2 or more men on the wheel to hold the ship on course. The size and shape of the rudder were critical. Too small, and the ship would be sluggish and difficult to turn. Too large, and the rudder would create excessive drag, slowing the ship. The rudder had to be immensely strong, bearing forces that could easily exceed several tons when the ship was moving through heavy seas at speed. Pintles and gudgeons formed the hinges attaching the rudder to the stern post. These metal fittings had to be perfectly aligned and incredibly strong, as the entire rudder hung from them. In battle, losing the rudder was catastrophic. A ship that couldn't steer was helpless, unable to maneuver or escape, often leading to capture or destruction. Below decks, the interior of a wooden ship was a maze of spaces, each with its specific purpose, all fitted together like a three-dimensional puzzle. The hold, the lowest deck, stored cargo, ballast, and provisions. Ballast, typically stones or iron, was essential to lower the ship's center of gravity and prevent capsizing. Cargo was carefully stowed to maintain the ship's trim, its balance fore and aft. Improper loading could make a ship impossible to steer or cause it to sail poorly. The orlop deck, just above the hold in larger ships, was below the waterline and housed the cable tier where the massive anchor cables were stored, along with storerooms for spare parts and equipment. The gun deck in warships was a low-ceilinged space where cannons were mounted, their muzzles protruding through gun ports in the hull. Headroom was minimal, forcing sailors to move hunched over. The berth deck, where sailors slept, was crowded and uncomfortable. Sailors slept in hammocks slung from the deck beams, swaying with the ship's motion. This was actually more comfortable than a rigid bunk. Officers had cabins, small private spaces with a bunk, a desk, and perhaps a chair. Even these were tiny by modern standards, but they offered precious privacy on a ship where hundreds lived in close proximity. The galley, where food was prepared, featured a brick or iron firebox secured to the deck. Cooking at sea was challenging, as the fire had to be managed carefully to prevent setting the wooden ship ablaze. The powder magazine, where gunpowder was stored in warships, was lined with copper to prevent sparks. It was kept damp and cool, and no one entered with shoes or anything that might create a spark. Pumps, essential for removing the water that inevitably leaked into the hold, were worked manually by sailors in shifts. Every wooden ship leaked to some degree, and pumping was a constant chore. With the structure complete, the ship was finished with paint, decoration, and all the details that made it beautiful as well as functional. The hull was typically painted. In the age of sail, warships often had distinctive paint schemes, black hull with white or yellow stripes at the gun deck levels, creating a pattern that became iconic. Merchant ships were often painted more simply, though many featured decorative work at the bow and stern. The transom, the flat surface at the stern, was a canvas for elaborate carvings and gilding. The figurehead, carved at the bow beneath the bowsprit, was both decoration and symbol. These sculptures depicted mythical figures, animals, or symbols meaningful to the ship's name or nation. Carved figureheads could be works of art, created by specialist carvers who understood how to shape wood to catch the eye and withstand the forces of wind and sea. The stern galleries, windowed structures projecting from the stern of large ships, provided light and air to the captain's quarters and offered a place to walk and observe. Trail boards, carved and gilded panels running from the figurehead back along the bow, framed the forward part of the ship in elaborate decoration. Inside, fine ships had carved and painted woodwork in the officers' quarters and great cabin. Paneling, decorative pillars, and even furniture might be built in by the ship's carpenter. The ship's bell, hung near the helm, was used to mark time and signal. Every half hour, the bell was struck in a pattern that sailors learned to recognize even from sleep. The ship's name was displayed on the transom in gold leaf or paint, along with the port of registry. This identification was both practical and a point of pride. The launch was a momentous occasion, when the ship first touched water after months or years of construction. The entire community would gather to witness this moment. The ship rested on a cradle that slid down greased ways, inclined ramps leading to the water. When the blocks holding it were knocked away, the ship would slide down under its own weight. As the ship entered the water for the first time, it would tip and rock before settling to its designed waterline. This moment revealed whether the calculations of the shipwright were correct. After launch, the ship was towed to a fitting-out berth where masts were stepped, rigging installed, and all the final equipment loaded aboard. This process could take weeks or months. The first sail was a test of everything. The ship was loaded with ballast to approximate its sailing weight, and a crew took it out to see how it performed. A new ship had to work in, allowing its timbers to swell and close up, its rigging to stretch and settle. The first voyages often revealed issues that needed adjustment. The speed and handling of a new ship were critically important. A fast ship could outrun enemies or make more profitable voyages. A sluggish ship might need modification to improve its performance. The ship's trim, how it sat in the water, could be adjusted by moving ballast forward or aft. Finding the optimal trim for best speed and handling was an art refined through experience. The captain and crew learned the ship's personality, its quirks and preferences. Every ship was different, requiring slightly different handling to bring out its best performance. Once fully commissioned and proven seaworthy, the ship began its working life, whether as a merchant vessel, a warship, or an explorer venturing into unknown waters. A wooden ship required constant maintenance. Wood rots, sails wear out, ropes fray, and iron rusts. Neglect a wooden ship, and it will quickly become unseaworthy. Holystoning the deck was a daily chore. Sailors scrubbed the deck planks with sandstone blocks called holystones, keeping the wood clean and preventing rot from taking hold. The seams between planks had to be regularly inspected and recaulked when they opened up as the wood worked. This was ongoing work, never truly finished. Painting and tarring protected the wood from weather and rot. The hull below the waterline was coated with a mixture that deterred marine growth, though these creatures still found ways to attach. Shipworms, marine borers, were a constant threat in tropical waters. These mollusks would bore into wooden hulls, honeycomb the planks, and eventually cause structural failure. Copper sheathing, thin sheets of copper nailed over the hull below the waterline, was developed in the 18th century. This protected against shipworms and reduced marine growth, dramatically extending a ship's life. Careening, pulling the ship over on its side at low tide, allowed workers to access and repair the underwater hull. This was done on beaches or at special careening wharves. Masts and yards were inspected regularly for cracks or rot. A mast failure at sea could be catastrophic, leaving the ship helpless or even capsizing if it fell wrong. Sails were taken down, repaired, and sometimes replaced completely. A sail loft was an essential part of any port, where sailmakers worked to keep fleets seaworthy. Rigging had to be regularly inspected and replaced. A parted line at a critical moment could cause the loss of a mast or even the entire ship. Shipbuilding traditions varied around the world, each culture developing techniques suited to their waters, materials, and needs. The Arab dhow, with its distinctive lateen sail, was built using techniques passed down through centuries. These ships traded across the Indian Ocean, from East Africa to India and beyond. Chinese junks featured flat bottoms for shallow water navigation, multiple masts, and innovative watertight compartments that prevented the entire ship from flooding if damaged. The watertight bulkhead, standard on Chinese junks for over 1,000 years, didn't appear in European ships until the 19th century. This innovation saved countless lives when it was finally adopted. Pacific Island outrigger canoes demonstrated remarkable understanding of stability and hydrodynamics. The outrigger prevented capsizing while adding minimal weight. Polynesian double-hulled voyaging canoes carried people across thousands of miles of open ocean, navigating by stars, waves, and birds. These vessels demonstrated sophisticated nautical engineering. Viking longships combined shallow draft with seaworthiness, allowing them to navigate rivers and cross oceans. Their clinker-built hulls were light yet strong. Mediterranean galleys, propelled by oars, dominated warfare in that sea for thousands of years. These sleek vessels were built for speed and maneuverability in calm waters. The Venetian arsenal was perhaps the first mass production facility, building galleys with standardized parts and assembly line techniques in the 16th century. Baltic cogs, with their straight stems and sterns and single square sail, were the workhorses of medieval northern European trade, sturdy and capacious. The age of exploration demanded ships capable of crossing oceans and returning home. This drove rapid innovation in ship design and construction. The caravel, developed by Portuguese shipwrights in the 15th century, combined a carvel-built hull with lateen sails, creating a ship that could sail close to the wind and handle ocean voyages. Columbus's Santa Maria was a now, a larger ship type, while the Nina and Pinta were caravels. These relatively small ships crossed the Atlantic, proving that ocean voyages were possible. The carrack evolved in the 15th and 16th centuries, growing larger to carry more cargo and provisions for long voyages. These ships featured multiple decks and a combination of square and lateen sails. The galleon emerged in the 16th century, a warship design that combined cargo capacity with fighting power. These were the ships that carried treasure from the Americas and fought the great naval battles. Galleons featured a lower, sleeker profile than earlier carracks, making them faster and more maneuverable. The reduction of the forecastle improved sailing qualities. The Manila galleons, built in the Philippines from tropical hardwoods, sailed the Pacific trade route between Manila and Acapulco for over 250 years, the longest trade route in history. Dutch East Indiamen, built for the spice trade, were large, heavily armed merchant ships. The Dutch pioneered the flight, a specialized cargo ship with a narrow stern to reduce harbor fees. The flight was an economic innovation as much as a technical one, designed to maximize cargo while minimizing crew size, making Dutch shipping more profitable. Ships grew larger as trade expanded. A 16th-century carrack might carry 500 tons. By the 18th century, East Indiamen carried 1,000 tons or more. The 18th and 19th centuries represented the peak of wooden sailing ship development, when every element was refined to near perfection. The ship of the line, the battleship of the Age of Sail, carried 64 to over 100 guns on multiple decks. These massive vessels represented the ultimate expression of naval power. HMS Victory, Nelson's flagship at Trafalgar, required 6,000 trees for its construction and carried 104 guns. It took 6 years to build and is still afloat today, the oldest commissioned warship. Frigates were lighter, faster warships, with a single gun deck. These were the cruisers of their day, used for scouting, commerce raiding, and independent operations. The East India Company's ships combined passenger accommodation with cargo capacity and armament. These were some of the finest ships built, elegant and powerful. Baltimore clippers, built in America in the early 19th century, were among the fastest sailing ships ever made. Their sharp hulls and tall rigs made them popular as privateers and later as slave ships. The clipper ship, developed in the 1840s, represented the absolute peak of speed under sail. These ships were built for the tea trade and the California gold rush, emphasizing speed above all. Clippers like Cutty Sark and Flying Cloud achieved speeds exceeding 20 knots and could sail from New York to California in 90 days, a remarkable achievement. The Clipper's hull was fine and sharp, with a nearly vertical stem and long, clean waterlines. Every element was designed to reduce drag and maximize speed. Clipper ships required large crews of skilled sailors to handle the immense sail area. These were the most demanding ships to sail, requiring constant attention and expert seamanship. Different purposes demanded different designs, leading to a remarkable variety of vessel types, each optimized for its specific role. Whalers were built sturdy and capacious, with facilities for processing whales at sea. These ships might stay at sea for years, sailing from the Arctic to the Antarctic in pursuit of their quarry. Fishing vessels, from Grand Bank schooners to North Sea herring boats, were designed for their specific fisheries. Speed to market was essential, as fresh fish commanded premium prices. Coastal traders, often called coasters, were built with shallow drafts to enter small harbors and navigate shoals. These workhorses carried goods from port to port along coastlines. Pilot boats were fast, weatherly vessels that could sail out in any conditions to meet incoming ships and transfer a pilot aboard for safe harbor entry. Slavers, despite their horrific purpose, were often fast, well-built ships designed to outrun naval patrols. After slavery was abolished, many were converted to other trades. Revenue cutters, built for customs enforcement, needed speed to chase smugglers. These sleek vessels influenced the development of racing yachts. Barges and lighters, often without masts, were towed or pulled through harbors and rivers, moving cargo from large ships to shore or between different vessels. Canal boats were built to fit the specific dimensions of canals, maximizing capacity while fitting through locks. These vessels were pulled by horses or mules walking towpaths. Icebreakers, built with reinforced bows and extra-strong hulls, could force their way through ice. Early versions were wooden, using brute force and strong construction. Salvage vessels carried diving equipment and specialized gear for recovering cargo from sunken ships. These vessels needed stability and lifting equipment. The age of wooden sailing ships began to end in the mid-19th century with the advent of steam power and iron construction. Steam engines, initially auxiliary power for sailing ships, gradually became primary propulsion. Early steamships still carried full-sail rigs as backup and to save coal. Iron and later steel hulls could be built larger and stronger than wooden ships. They didn't rot, weren't attacked by shipworms, and could withstand harder use. The first iron-hulled ships were viewed with suspicion. Sailors doubted that iron could float, and early iron ships had problems with biofouling and compass deviation from the metal hull. Composite ships, with iron frames and wooden planking, represented a transition technology, combining the best of both materials before all-metal construction became standard. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, favored steamships over sailing ships. Steam power provided reliable transit times, while sailing ships might wait weeks for favorable winds. The last commercial sailing ships, the great windjammers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were actually larger than earlier vessels, built of steel but still relying primarily on wind. The Preussen, a 5-masted steel-hulled ship, was the largest sailing vessel ever built, 438 feet long. She represented the absolute final evolution of the sailing ship. World War I essentially ended the age of commercial sail. The demand for tonnage and the dangers of slow vessels in submarine-infested waters drove the final transition to steam. By the 1930s, only a few sailing ships remained in commercial service, mostly in remote trades where they still made economic sense. The age of sail was over. The skills of wooden shipbuilding, refined over millennia, represented an immense body of practical knowledge passed from generation to generation. A master shipwright spent decades learning his craft, starting as an apprentice and working through journeyman to master. Each step required years of experience. The ability to read wood, to understand its properties and predict its behavior, couldn't be taught from books alone. It required handling thousands of pieces, seeing how each one worked. Eye for proportion and curve distinguished great shipwrights. The most beautiful ships had a rightness to their lines that spoke to both aesthetics and hydrodynamics. Tools were specialized and often handmade. The adze, a chisel-like tool with a perpendicular blade, could remove large amounts of wood quickly while leaving a smooth surface. The broadaxe, with a wide blade, was used to square logs into beams. Skilled workers could achieve remarkably flat, smooth surfaces with nothing but an axe. Augers drilled the holes for tree nails. These had to be perfectly aligned and sized, requiring steady hands and years of practice. Caulking irons, used with mallets to drive oakum into seams, came in different shapes for different situations, straight for straight seams, curved for tight spaces. Patterns and templates, often made from thin wood, allowed complex shapes to be reproduced. These patterns were treasured possessions, representing successful solutions to difficult problems. The master shipwright's half model, carved from layers of wood, represented the ship's whole shape. This three-dimensional sketch allowed the design to be studied and modified before construction. Different regions developed distinctive shipbuilding styles based on local materials, conditions, and traditions. New England shipyards built merchant ships and whalers from local white pine and oak. These ships were known for solid construction and practical design. Chesapeake Bay builders created the distinctive skipjack and bugeye, shallow-draft oyster boats adapted to the bay's conditions. Their elegance combined beauty with function. The Pacific Northwest, with its vast forests of Douglas fir and cedar, built large schooners for the lumber trade. These vessels could carry enormous cargoes of timber. Maine became famous for its wooden shipbuilding, producing some of the finest sailing ships of the 19th century. Down east schooners were particularly prized. British shipyards, particularly those on the Thames and at Portsmouth, built the Royal Navy's ships to exacting standards. These yards employed thousands and perfected mass production techniques. French shipyards built elegant vessels that were often faster than their British counterparts, though sometimes at the expense of sturdiness. French naval architects were highly respected. Spanish yards built the galleons that carried treasure from the Americas, using tropical hardwoods and techniques adapted from centuries of Mediterranean tradition. Dutch shipyards pioneered efficient production methods, building flights and other merchant vessels in large numbers. The Dutch dominated maritime trade in the 17th century partly through superior shipbuilding. Scandinavian builders maintained traditions dating to Viking times, building strong vessels suited to northern seas. Their ships were known for seaworthiness. Asian shipyards built using entirely different traditions, creating junks, dhows, and other vessels perfectly adapted to their regions, demonstrating that there were many solutions to the challenge of building ships. The shipwright's toolkit contained specialized instruments refined over centuries, each designed for specific tasks in the complex process of shipbuilding. The shipwright's level and plumb bob ensured that the keel was perfectly horizontal and frames perfectly vertical. Any error here would compound throughout the construction. Measuring rods and rules had to be accurate and consistent. Before standardized measurements, each shipyard might have its own system, leading to confusion when ships needed repairs elsewhere. The bevel board, an adjustable angle finder, allowed complex angles to be measured and reproduced. Every frame had dozens of angles that needed to be precisely cut. Calipers measured thickness and transferred measurements from patterns to wood. Inside calipers checked internal dimensions, while outside calipers measured external ones. The chalk line, a string coated with chalk, could snap straight lines across large surfaces. This simple tool was essential for laying out plank positions and cut lines. Scribing compasses transferred shapes and curves, walking along complex forms to mark where cuts should be made. The smoothing plane created final surfaces on timber, leaving them fair and smooth. Different planes existed for different situations, long planes for straight work, short planes for curves. Screw jacks and wedges provided the enormous forces needed to bend planks and pull joints tight. Leverage and patience could move timbers weighing tons. The steam box, a long sealed chamber heated by a fire, made wood pliable enough to bend. Timing was critical. Too little steaming left wood brittle, too much weakened it. Scaffolding and staging allowed workers to reach high parts of the hull. As the ship grew, these temporary structures grew with it, creating a wooden forest around the vessel. The shipyard itself was a carefully organized workspace, evolved over centuries to enable efficient construction of large, complex wooden structures. The ways, sloped ramps leading to the water, were positioned to allow ships to slide into the water at launch. Their construction had to be immensely strong to support ships weighing hundreds or thousands of tons. The mold loft, a large open floor space, was where the ship's lines were drawn full size. This was the translation from small drawings to actual dimensions. Soppits, excavations with logs positioned across them, allowed two men to saw large logs into planks. The pitmen below and the topmen above worked together in rhythmic motion. Later, water-powered and then steam-powered sawmills mechanized this process, greatly increasing productivity and reducing the backbreaking labor. The timber seasoning yard stored wood under cover, allowing it to dry slowly and naturally. Rushing this process would result in inferior timber that would crack and warp. The blacksmith's forge was essential, producing the thousands of metal fittings every ship required, nails, bolts, chain plates, hinges, and countless other pieces. The rope walk, a long, narrow building or open space, allowed rope makers to twist fibers into rope of any length. Long rope walks could be a quarter-mile in length. The sail loft, a large open space with good light, housed sailmakers who cut and stitched the miles of canvas required for a ship's sails. The paint and tar sheds stored these essential but hazardous materials. Tar was kept warm to remain liquid, requiring careful fire management. The ship's boat shop built the smaller boats every ship carried, longboats, jolly boats, and captain's gigs. These boats were themselves complex craft requiring skill to build. Throughout history, certain ships became legendary either for their beauty, their achievements, or their historical significance. HMS Victory, laid down in 1759, represents the pinnacle of ship-of-the-line construction. Every aspect of her 2,000-ton hull was designed for battle. Victory's construction consumed 6,000 trees, mostly oak, representing about 100 acres of forest. Each tree had to be carefully selected for its specific purpose in the structure. The USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, was built with live oak, one of the hardest woods available. This made her hull remarkably resistant to cannon fire. Constitution's live oak came from the southern United States, where this dense wood grew slowly, creating timber so strong that cannonballs sometimes bounced off. The Mary Rose, Henry VIII warship, sank in 1545 and was raised in 1982. Her remarkably preserved hull revealed Tudor shipbuilding techniques in extraordinary detail. The Vasa, a Swedish warship that sank on her maiden voyage in 1628, was raised in 1961. Her nearly complete preservation allowed detailed study of 17th-century construction methods. Vasa's elaborate decoration, with hundreds of carved and gilded sculptures, demonstrated how warships were symbols of national power and prestige. The Cutty Sark, one of the last tea clippers, was built in 1869 with a composite construction, iron frame with wooden planking, representing the transition between wooden and metal ships. Cutty Sark's fine lines and enormous sail area made her one of the fastest ships of her era. She's preserved in dry dock in Greenwich, allowing visitors to appreciate her elegant construction. The Mayflower, though less famous for her construction than her voyage, was a typical merchant vessel of her time, demonstrating how even ordinary ships could make extraordinary journeys. Ship design was intimately connected with navigation, as builders had to create vessels capable of surviving voyages to distant waters and returning home. The compass binnacle, a wooden housing near the helm, protected the ship's magnetic compass while positioning it for easy viewing by the helmsman. Dead reckoning, navigation by calculating position based on speed and direction, required ships with consistent, predictable sailing characteristics. The log line and chip log measured speed through the water. A knotted line was played out as a piece of wood, the chip stayed in place, and the knots passing through the sailor's hands in a measured time gave the speed in knots. The quarterdeck's position gave officers clear views for taking celestial sights with sextants and octants, essential tools for determining latitude and longitude. Chart tables below decks provided workspace for navigation, plotting courses on charts that themselves were often works of art, drawn by hand. The chronometer, an accurate clock, was housed in a special box on gimbals to keep it level despite the ship's motion. Knowing accurate time was essential for determining longitude. Soundings, measuring water depth with a lead line, required specific features built into ships. The chains, platforms extending from the hull near the bow, gave room for swinging the lead. The ship's bell marked time in watches and half-hour intervals, creating the rhythm by which shipboard life operated. Every ship had its distinctive bell, often inscribed with the ship's name. The bit, strong posts fixed through the deck and keelson, secured anchor cables. These had to withstand enormous forces when the ship rode to anchor in a gale. The way sailors lived aboard shaped ship design, as builders had to provide for crews spending months or years at sea. Ventilation was critical in wooden ships. Wind sails, cloth tubes ridged to funnel air below decks, and ventilator cowls brought fresh air to the spaces where crews lived and worked. The head, the ship's toilet, was located at the bow, where wave action would wash it clean. This forward position on the beakhead gave us the term still used today. The galley's position was critical. It had to be accessible yet isolated because of fire danger. Iron stoves replaced earlier open brick fireboxes, reducing fire risk. The sick bay, where injured or ill sailors were treated, needed good light and ventilation. Ship's surgeons worked in difficult conditions, operating in rolling seas with limited equipment. The bread room stored ship's biscuit, sealed against vermin. These hard biscuits, often infested with weevils, were a staple of shipboard diet for centuries. The spirit room, where rum, wine, or other alcohol was stored, was under the purser's control. Alcohol was a significant part of sailors' rations and a source of discipline issues. The magazine's design protected gunpowder from sparks, dampness, and vermin. Felt slippers were worn inside, and lights were kept outside, with light coming through thick glass. The carpenter's walk, a space below the waterline, allowed the ship's carpenter to inspect the inside of the hull planking for leaks or damage while at sea. The shot locker stored cannonballs, arranged by size. These had to be secured so they wouldn't break loose and roll around in heavy weather, potentially damaging the ship or injuring crew. Ship designers had to account for every weather condition a ship might encounter, from dead calms to hurricanes, from tropical heat to Arctic ice. The shear, the upward curve of the deck from midships toward bow and stern, helped shed water. A ship with insufficient shear would be wet, with waves constantly washing over the deck. The tumble home, the inward curve of the upper hull, reduced weight high up and thus improved stability. This also narrowed the deck, which was taxed by width in some ports. Scuppers, holes through the bulwarks at deck level, allowed water that came aboard to drain quickly overboard. In heavy weather, massive amounts of water might be on deck momentarily. The gunwale, the reinforced top edge of the hull, had to be strong as it was frequently used to secure ropes and endured constant stress. Storm sails, smaller and stronger than working sails, were set in heavy weather. The ship had to be designed to handle this much reduced sail area and still remain controllable. Sea anchors, canvas drogues dragged behind the ship, could slow its drift in storms and keep the bow pointed into the waves. Ships had to have strong points to secure these. Ice sheathing, extra planking on the hull at the waterline, protected ships operating in ice-prone waters. Some polar exploration vessels had double or triple hulls. Copper sheathing, though primarily against shipworms, also reduced ice damage and marine growth. The smooth copper surface prevented ice from getting a grip. Battens, strips of wood, secured hatches in storms. Batten down the hatches wasn't just an expression but a critical safety procedure. Creating smooth, fair curves in a wooden hull required exceptional skill and understanding of three-dimensional shapes. Fairing meant creating hull surfaces that were smooth and continuous, without bumps or hollows that would disturb water flow and slow the ship. The shipwright's eye was the primary tool for fairing. Walking around the hull, sighting along planks, feeling with hands, experience taught what looked and felt right. Battens, thin flexible strips of wood, were bent along the hull to check fairness. If a batten wouldn't lie smoothly, the curve needed adjustment. Spiling, the process of creating patterns for complex plank shapes, involved careful measurement and transfer of shapes from the hull to the pattern and then to the plank. Each plank had to twist and curve in multiple dimensions to fit the hull. This required understanding how wood would behave when forced into these complex shapes. The land, or edge bevel, of each plank had to be carefully shaped so planks would fit tightly together. This varied along the plank's length as the hull's curve changed. Dubbing, or fairing the outside of frames before planking, created the precise surface the planks would follow. This was done with adzes and long planes, requiring great skill. The stern, with its complex curves transitioning from the hull's sides to a flat or rounded transom, was particularly challenging to fair. Master shipwrights prided themselves on beautiful sterns. The bow, where planks converged at the stem, required planks to twist dramatically. Each plank had to fit perfectly to its neighbors, despite these complex curves. The turn of the bilge, where the bottom curved up into the sides, was another critical area. The fairness here affected both speed and stability. The way pieces of wood were joined together largely determined a ship's strength and longevity. Mortise and tenon joints, where a projection on one piece fit into a hole in another, were secured with wooden pins. These joints were used extensively in frame assembly. Scarf joints connected pieces end to end, typically at an angle with the pieces overlapping. The long diagonal surface provided ample gluing and fastening area. The quality of a scarf joint could be judged by striking it. A good joint sounded solid, while a poor one sounded hollow. Treenails, or trunnels, were wooden pins driven through pre-drilled holes to secure planks to frames and timbers to timbers. When wet, they swelled to create incredibly tight joints. Treenails were made from hard wood, typically oak or locust, split rather than sawed to follow the grain. This gave them strength in all directions. The end of each treenail was split and a wedge driven in, expanding the end to prevent it from pulling out. This had to be done carefully to avoid splitting the surrounding wood. Iron bolts and spikes were used where the greatest strength was needed, particularly in connecting the keel, stem, and stern post, and in fastening the heavy hanging knees. Copper bolts were used below the waterline because they didn't rust. Copper was expensive, but the cost was justified by the increased longevity. The rule of fastening was that no single point of connection was critical. Redundancy and spreading loads over multiple connection points prevented catastrophic failure. Glue, made from animal hide, was used in some joints, though its reliability in a marine environment was limited. Mechanical fastening was always primary. Every ship carried smaller boats, themselves miniature wooden craft requiring skilled construction. The ship's boats served multiple purposes: going ashore when the ship was anchored offshore, rescue in case the ship foundered, and handling operations like setting out anchors. The longboat was the largest, capable of carrying significant loads or towing the ship in calm conditions. It might be 20 to 30 feet long, requiring several rowers. The captain's gig was smaller and lighter, used to ferry the captain ashore. These boats were often beautifully finished, reflecting the captain's status. Jolly boats were utility boats, used for routine ship-to-shore transport and general work. They needed to be tough and easy to handle. Ships' boats were typically clinker-built, with overlapping planks. This construction was lighter than carvel building and more flexible, important for boats that would be hoisted and lowered regularly. The boats were stowed on deck or in davits, swinging cranes that allowed them to be lowered over the side. Securing them for sea was essential, as a loose boat could cause significant damage in rough weather. Oars for ships' boats were made from carefully selected straight-grained wood, typically ash or spruce. They had to be light enough to row for hours yet strong enough not to break under strain. Boat builders developed their own specialized skills, distinct from shipbuilding though related. The best boat builders could produce incredibly light yet strong craft. Emergency rowing rigs could be fitted to ships' boats, turning them into small sailing craft capable of covering considerable distances if the ship was lost. The maintenance of ships' boats was a constant task. Exposed to sun and salt, they required regular attention to prevent deterioration. Ship design evolved through trial and error, as successful features were copied and unsuccessful ones abandoned. Hydrodynamics, the science of how water flows around hulls, was understood intuitively long before it was formalized mathematically. Shipwrights learned what worked through observation. The development of scientific naval architecture in the 18th century, particularly by Swedish, French, and British theorists, began to explain why certain hull shapes worked better. Model testing and towing tanks allowed designers to test hull forms before building full-size ships, reducing the risk of expensive failures. The lines of a ship, drawn in profile, plan, and section views, allowed designs to be accurately recorded and reproduced. This documentation enabled the preservation and transmission of successful designs. Naval architecture evolved from a craft tradition to an engineering discipline, with schools established to train designers in mathematics and physics as well as practical shipbuilding. The coefficient of fineness, a measure of how much the hull's volume differed from a rectangular box of the same dimensions, became a key design parameter. Stability calculations became formalized, allowing designers to predict how a ship would behave rather than hoping their intuition was correct. The center of gravity and center of buoyancy had to be carefully considered. Too high a center of gravity made a ship unstable, too low made it roll uncomfortably. The prismatic coefficient, the relationship between a hull's volume distribution and its length, affected wave-making resistance and thus speed. These theoretical advances didn't replace the shipwright's experience but complemented it, combining empirical knowledge with mathematical understanding. Though commercial wooden shipbuilding has largely vanished, the tradition continues in restoration, recreation, and small-scale craft. Wooden boat festivals celebrate traditional craft, with builders and sailors gathering to share knowledge and showcase vessels built using traditional techniques. Maritime museums preserve not just ships but also the knowledge of how they were built and sailed. Working demonstrations keep ancient skills alive. Traditional shipwright apprenticeships still exist in some places, training new generations in skills that stretch back millennia. The restoration of historic ships like HMS Victory and USS Constitution requires maintaining traditional building skills, as these vessels must be repaired using original techniques. Recreation of historic vessels, such as the various Viking ship replicas, teaches builders and sailors about ancient techniques through hands-on experience. Wooden yacht building continues, with modern glues and finishes making wooden boats more practical than ever. These boats combined traditional beauty with modern performance. The resurgence of interest in traditional sailing craft has led to workshops and schools teaching wooden boat building worldwide. Environmental concerns have renewed interest in sustainable wooden boat construction, as wood is renewable while fiberglass and metal require significant industrial processing. The sensory experience of wooden boats, their smell, sound, and feel, connects us to maritime history in ways that modern materials cannot replicate. And so we complete our journey through the ancient art of wooden shipbuilding, from the first hollow log to the magnificent ships that conquered the oceans. Every wooden ship was a collaboration between the shipwright and nature, between human skill and the living wood. Each vessel was unique, with its own personality shaped by countless decisions and the particular characteristics of the wood from which it was built. The knowledge required to build a wooden ship encompassed geometry and physics, engineering and art, tradition and innovation. A master shipwright was part craftsman, part artist, part engineer. In the grain of wood lies the history of forests that grew for centuries. In the curve of a ship's hull lies the accumulated wisdom of generations of builders, each one refining and improving on what came before. The tools have quieted in most shipyards now, replaced by the sounds of welding and machinery. But the wooden ships that remain, floating museums and sailing testaments to human ingenuity, continue to inspire. When you see a wooden ship, know that you are looking at thousands of decisions, tens of thousands of hours of skilled labor, and knowledge refined over millennia. Each timber was selected, shaped, and fitted by human hands guided by experienced eyes. These ships carried humanity across unknown waters, connected distant shores, and expanded our world. They were built with hand tools, human muscle, and deep knowledge of wood and water. The crack of canvas in the wind, the creak of rigging, the gentle groan of timbers working, these sounds once filled every harbor, a symphony of wood and rope and wind. Though the age of wooden ships has passed, their legacy remains. Every modern ship owes something to these ancestors, to the lessons learned through centuries of building with wood. Rest now in the knowledge of this craft, this ancient art. Let the rhythm of the caulking mallet echo gently in your mind. Feel the smooth curve of a well-shaped timber beneath your hand. The ships are quiet now, resting at anchor or preserved in museums. But their stories continue, whispered in the grain of old wood, remembered in the curves of hulls that knew distant seas. Sleep well, with the scent of sawdust and tar, the sound of wind in rigging, the gentle motion of a ship at rest. Dream of forests becoming ships, of wood transformed into vessels that carry dreams across the waters of the world.